Harrison Ford rescues a stray dog from a blizzard. What they find together is incredible. The wind howled fiercely against the sturdy log walls of the cabin, rattling the window panes as if begging to be let inside. Harrison Ford sat at the edge of his chair, the fire crackling weakly in the hearth as its warmth struggled to fend off the cold, creeping in from the mountain storm. His hands, calloused from years of climbing and carpentry, cradled a mug of lukewarm coffee that he hadn't touched in hours. He stared out the frost-covered window into the swirling white abyss, his reflection faint against the storm's fury. The cabin had been his refuge for the past 2 years, a place he retreated to when the weight of loss became unbearable. Clara, his wife of 3 decades, had been his anchor, his partner, in every sense of the word. She was the one who had always found the beauty in the mundane, who had convinced him to buy this cabin in the first place, insisting they needed a sanctuary away from the city's chaos. Now, it was nothing more than a hollow reminder of what he'd lost. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil inside Harrison, each gust of wind pulling at a memory he tried to bury. He set the mug down and rose from his chair, pulling on his thick parka and heavy boots. The rhythmic act of chopping wood had become his ritual, a way to silence the noise in his head. He grabbed his axe from the corner and stepped outside, the icy air biting at his face. The snow was deeper than he'd expected, nearly up to his knees. It clung to his beard and parka as he trudged toward the woodpile. The axe's handle felt solid in his grip, and for a brief moment he relished the simple physicality of splitting logs, each crack of the wood breaking the storm's deafening roar. But then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Harrison froze, the axe poised mid-swing. Through the wind's relentless howling came a faint, high-pitched noise, a yelp, perhaps. He turned his head, straining to catch it again. For a moment, there was nothing but the wind. Then it came again, a weak, almost desperate sound carried by the storm. "Impossible," he muttered, shaking his head. The storm was too fierce for anything to be out there. Still, something in the pit of his stomach urged him to investigate. He dropped the axe into the snow and grabbed a flashlight from the porch. The beam of light was nearly useless against the thick curtain of snow, but Harrison pressed on, following the faint sound deeper into the wilderness. Each step was a struggle. The snow grew deeper, the wind cutting through even his thickest layers. He stumbled over hidden roots and rocks, the cold seeping into his bones. The yelping grew louder, more insistent, guiding him like a beacon through the storm. Finally, he spotted a dark shape against the white expanse. At first, it looked like a mound of snow, but as he drew closer, the shape resolved into the form of a dog, its fur matted with ice, its body trembling violently. "Hey there," Harrison called out, his voice rough from the cold. He knelt beside the animal, his hands brushing away the snow that had nearly buried it. The dog opened its eyes, its gaze locking onto his with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. "Hang on, buddy," Harrison murmured. He could feel the dog's ribs beneath its fur, the frailty of a creature pushed to its limits. He wrapped his arms around the animal, lifting it carefully. The dog didn't resist, its head lolling against his chest as if surrendering to whatever came next. The journey back to the cabin was agonizing. The added weight of the dog slowed Harrison's steps, and the wind seemed to grow fiercer with every passing moment. His muscles screamed in protest, but he pressed on, focusing on the faint glow of the cabin's lights in the distance. When he finally stumbled through the door, the warmth hit him like a wave. He placed the dog gently on the worn rug by the fireplace, quickly stoking the fire until the flames roared to life. He pulled off his coat and boots, then fetched a blanket to wrap around the shivering animal. The dog's breathing was shallow but steady. Its coat, now visible under the melting snow, was a mix of black and tan, its frame large but gaunt from starvation. Harrison ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "What the hell were you doing out there?" he muttered, more to himself than to the dog. He grabbed a bowl of water and placed it near the animal's head. After a few moments, the dog stirred, its nose twitching. It opened its eyes again, looking up at Harrison with an intensity that made him pause. There was something in its gaze, an awareness, almost a purpose, that unsettled him. "You're safe now," Harrison said softly. He wasn't sure if he was reassuring the dog or himself. As the fire crackled and the storm raged on outside, Harrison sat beside the animal, watching as it slowly drifted into a restless sleep. The storm had calmed by morning, leaving behind a pristine blanket of snow that sparkled under the pale winter sun. Inside the cabin, The air was thick with warmth from the roaring fire. Harrison sat at the edge of the couch, a steaming mug of coffee in one hand, his eyes fixed on the dog lying by the hearth. The animal had barely moved since the night before, its sides rising and falling with shallow breaths. Harrison had cleaned its fur as best as he could, brushing away clumps of ice and dirt. Now, in the light of day, the dog's condition was even clearer. Its ribs jutted out beneath its thin coat, and its paws were cracked and raw. "You've been through hell," Harrison murmured, sipping his coffee. The dog's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, and for the first time, its eyes opened fully. They were sharp and amber, scanning the room before landing on Harrison. There was a quiet intelligence in that gaze, something that made Harrison straighten slightly. "Morning, buddy," he said, setting the mug down. He reached out cautiously, his hand hovering near the dog's head. The animal sniffed his fingers before letting out a soft whine, leaning into the touch. Harrison felt a small smile tug at the corners of his mouth. "Guess we're friends now, huh?" He stood and walked to the kitchen, rummaging through the cabinets for anything that might pass as dog food. Eventually, he found a leftover piece of roast chicken wrapped in foil. He shredded it into small pieces and placed it in a bowl, setting it down near the dog. "Not much, but it's better than nothing," he said. The dog hesitated for a moment before lowering its head to eat. Harrison watched as it devoured the food with a hunger that made his chest ache. As the day went on, the dog's strength began to return. It stood shakily on its legs, exploring the small cabin with cautious steps. Harrison couldn't help but feel a strange sense of companionship as he watched the animal inspect every corner of the room, its nose twitching. "What should I call you?" he asked aloud. The dog glanced at him but didn't respond, of course. Harrison chuckled. "How about Scout? You look like a scout." The name felt fitting, and as if sensing this, the dog wagged its tail faintly. "Scout it is," Harrison said, nodding. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Harrison sat on the porch steps watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. Scout sat beside him, his fur ruffling in the gentle breeze. The storm had left the landscape transformed, the trees heavy with snow and the world eerily quiet. For a brief moment, Harrison felt a flicker of peace, the kind he hadn't known in years, but it didn't last long. Scout's ears perked up suddenly, his body tensing. He stood and let out a low growl, his gaze fixed on the distant tree line. "What is it?" Harrison asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. He scanned the horizon but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Scout barked once, sharp and urgent, before darting toward the edge of the porch. Harrison grabbed his coat and flashlight, following the dog into the yard. "Scout! Hey, wait!" The dog stopped just before the tree line, his nose to the ground, as he sniffed intently. Harrison caught up, his boots crunching in the snow. "What's going on, boy?" Scout barked again, then looked back at Harrison as if urging him to follow. "You're kidding me," Harrison muttered, shaking his head. "You want me to go in there?" The dog didn't move, his gaze unwavering. Harrison sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Fine. But if we get lost, this is on you." He grabbed a sturdy walking stick from the porch and stepped into the forest, Scout leading the way. The woods were eerily quiet, the snow muffling every sound except the crunch of their footsteps. Scout moved with purpose, his nose to the ground, occasionally stopping to sniff at the base of a tree or paw at the snow. Harrison followed reluctantly, his flashlight cutting through the growing darkness. "You better know where you're going," he muttered. After about 20 minutes, Scout stopped abruptly. He sniffed the air, then began pawing at a patch of snow near a fallen log. Harrison crouched beside him, brushing away the snow to reveal what the dog had found. It was faint, but there were tracks, human footprints, partially covered by the recent snowfall. Harrison frowned, his pulse quickening. "Someone else was out here," Scout barked, his tail wagging slightly. He stepped forward, following the tracks deeper into the woods. Harrison hesitated, glancing back toward the faint glow of his cabin in the distance. "Damn it," he muttered, tightening his grip on the flashlight. He followed the dog. The tracks led them to a small clearing where the snow was disturbed as if someone had been digging. Scout stopped at the edge of the clearing, his body rigid. He let out a low growl, his ears flattening. Harrison stepped forward cautiously, his breath visible in the cold air. He shone the flashlight over the disturbed snow, his heart racing. There was something buried there, something that glinted faintly under the beam of light. He knelt and began brushing the snow away with his hands, his fingers numb from the cold. After a few moments, he uncovered a metal object, a small, rusted box, its hinges frozen shut. "What the hell is this?" Harrison murmured. Scout barked again, his voice echoing through the quiet woods. Harrison glanced at the dog, his unease growing. "All right, let's get this back to the cabin," he said, tucking the box under his arm. He rose to his feet, casting one last glance at the clearing before turning back the way they came. Scout stayed close to his side as they made their way home, his eyes darting nervously toward the shadows. Back at the cabin, Harrison placed the rusted box on the kitchen table. It looked old, its edges worn smooth by time, with faint engravings barely visible beneath the rust. He turned it over in his hands, his brow furrowed. Scout sat beside him, his amber eyes locked on the box as though it held something more than just old metal. "What's in here, huh?" Harrison muttered, retrieving a screwdriver from a drawer. He wedged it under the lid, prying gently until the hinges gave way with a creak. Inside there was a folded piece of parchment and a photograph. Harrison carefully removed the items, his fingers brushing off decades of dust. The photograph was black and white, its edges yellowed with age. It showed a group of men in military uniforms standing in front of a small structure that looked like a bunker. One of them wore an emblem on his jacket that Harrison recognized instantly. It was the same insignia his father had worn in his old army photos. The parchment was brittle, the ink faded but legible. It seemed to be a map, marked with coordinates and a note scrawled in the corner. "Operation Sentinel, Base 14. Harrison's heart pounded. His father had never spoken much about his time in the service, only vague stories about missions in remote places. Could this be connected to him? He set the items down, his mind racing. "What have you led me to, Scout?" he asked, glancing at the dog. Scout let out a soft bark as if urging him forward. The next morning, Harrison stood at the edge of the forest with a backpack slung over his shoulder. Inside were essentials: food, water, a flashlight, and the map from the box. He had traced the coordinates to a location deeper into the mountains, far beyond where he'd ventured before. Scout trotted beside him, his energy renewed after a night's rest. The dog seemed eager, almost impatient, as though he knew what lay ahead. "All right, let's see where this takes us," Harrison said, adjusting the straps on his backpack. The snow crunched underfoot as they made their way into the wilderness. The forest was silent, except for the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. Harrison kept the map in his hand, following the faint markings that led them deeper into the trees. The terrain grew more challenging as they went on. The snow was deeper here, and the trees were spaced farther apart, their bare branches clawing at the sky. Harrison paused to catch his breath, leaning against a tree trunk. Scout, however, showed no signs of slowing. The dog darted ahead, his nose to the ground, then stopped and looked back, barking for Harrison to follow. "Hold on, I'm not as spry as you," Harrison muttered, pushing himself upright. They reached a ridge that overlooked a steep drop into a valley below. The view was breathtaking, the snow-covered expanse stretching out like a blank canvas. But Harrison's focus was on the map. The coordinates pointed directly to a spot in the valley, marked with a small X. "That's our destination," he said, folding the map and slipping it into his pocket. Scout barked again, his tail wagging furiously. As they descended into the valley, the path became treacherous. The snow concealed loose rocks and hidden roots, and more than once Harrison nearly lost his footing. Scout moved ahead with careful precision, stopping occasionally to wait for Harrison. When they finally reached the valley floor, the air was colder, the sunlight barely piercing through the thick canopy above. Harrison unfolded the map again, orienting himself with the landmarks around him. "There should be something here," he said, scanning the area. Scout suddenly froze, his ears perking up. He sniffed the air, then bolted toward a cluster of rocks partially buried in the snow. Harrison followed, his heart pounding. The dog began pawing at the snow, his movements frantic. Harrison knelt beside him, brushing away the powdery layers. What they uncovered made Harrison's breath catch in his throat. It was the entrance to a bunker, its metal door rusted and half hidden beneath the rocks. The insignia from the photograph was etched into the door, though time had worn it nearly smooth. "This can't be real," Harrison murmured, running his fingers over the engraving. Scout barked, his tail wagging as he paced in front of the door. Harrison hesitated for a moment before gripping the handle. It was stiff with age, but after a few tugs the door creaked open, revealing a dark passageway that descended into the earth. The air that wafted out was cold and stale, carrying the faint scent of metal and damp stone. He pulled a flashlight from his backpack, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Stay close, Scout," he said, stepping inside. The walls of the bunker were lined with shelves, their contents long since decayed. Papers crumbled at the slightest touch, and metal tools were coated in rust. As they moved deeper, Harrison's flashlight illuminated a desk at the far end of the room. On the desk was a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age. Harrison picked it up carefully, opening it to the first page. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was his father's. His hands trembled as he read the opening lines. Operation Sentinel. Day 1. We've been tasked with securing this site, but something doesn't feel right. The others are starting to notice it too. Harrison flipped through the pages, each entry more troubling than the last. His father had documented strange occurrences at the site. Equipment malfunctioning, unexplained noises in the night, and a growing sense of unease among the team. "This is insane," Harrison whispered. Scout let out a low growl, snapping Harrison out of his thoughts. The dog was staring down the hallway, his body tense. "What is it, boy?" Harrison asked, shining his flashlight toward the darkness. For a moment, there was nothing. Then a faint sound echoed through the bunker, a metallic clang as though something had shifted in the shadows. Harrison's grip on the flashlight tightened. "We're not alone here." The sound of the metallic clang echoed through the bunker, sending a chill down Harrison's spine. Scout stood at his side, his body rigid, ears perked, and a low growl rumbling from his throat. The beam of Harrison's flashlight trembled slightly as he directed it down the long corridor. "Easy, Scout," Harrison muttered, though his own voice betrayed his unease. He moved cautiously forward, his boots crunching on the dusty floor. The air grew colder the deeper they went, carrying with it an oppressive weight, as though the bunker itself were alive with memories it wanted to forget. Scout walked ahead, his nose low to the ground. Every so often he would pause, sniff the air, and glance back at Harrison, as if urging him to stay close. At the end of the corridor, they came to another room, larger than the first. The flashlight illuminated rows of metal cabinets, a rusted cot in the corner, and a table with scattered papers and equipment. But it wasn't the objects that caught Harrison's attention. It was what was painted on the far wall. A large emblem, faded but still discernible, was emblazoned across the concrete. It matched the insignia from the photograph, and below it were the words, "Operation Sentinel. Protect at all costs." "What the hell were they protecting?" Harrison murmured. Scout sniffed near the base of the wall, pawing at the ground as if searching for something. Harrison joined him, kneeling to inspect the area. The floor was uneven, and as he ran his hand over it, he felt a faint seam in the concrete. "There's something under here," he said, his pulse quickening. He grabbed a rusted crowbar from the table and wedged it into the seam. With a grunt of effort, he pried up a heavy slab, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside was a metal case, its surface marked with scratches and dents. Harrison carefully lifted the case out and set it on the table. The latches were stiff, but they gave way with enough force. Inside, he found a stack of documents, a small key, and a reel of old film. He picked up one of the documents, his eyes scanning the text. The words sent a shiver through him. "Experimental energy source, highly volatile, handle with extreme caution." "What were you into, Dad?" Harrison muttered, his brow furrowing. Scout barked suddenly, his head snapping toward the corridor they had come from. The sound reverberated through the bunker, and for a moment, Harrison thought he heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. He grabbed the metal case and tucked it under his arm. "We're leaving," he said to Scout, his voice firm. They retraced their steps, the tension thickening with every passing second. The faint sound of footsteps persisted, though Harrison couldn't tell if it was his imagination or something real. As they reached the entrance, a sudden gust of wind rushed past them, slamming the bunker door shut behind them with a deafening clang. Scout barked in alarm, but Harrison didn't stop to investigate. He pushed forward, the cold mountain air a welcome contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside. Back at the cabin, Harrison wasted no time. He set the metal case on the kitchen table and spread out its contents. Scout lay nearby, his eyes fixed on Harrison as if sensing the importance of what was happening. The documents were detailed, outlining an experiment conducted decades ago. Harrison's father and his team had been tasked with testing a new energy source, one that promised to revolutionize power generation. But something had gone wrong. The records were fragmented, with entire sections blacked out, but the tone of the reports was clear. The experiment had been dangerous, and the fallout had been catastrophic. The film reel intrigued Harrison the most. He retrieved an old projector from a closet, a relic from his days of documenting expeditions, and set it up on the living room wall. As the film began to play, the room was bathed in flickering light. The footage was grainy, but it showed a group of men, his father among them, working in the bunker. They were setting up equipment, their faces tense with concentration. Then the scene shifted. The men were panicked, running toward the camera as a bright light filled the frame. The film ended abruptly, leaving Harrison staring at a blank wall. "What happened down there?" he whispered. Scout whined softly, pressing his nose against Harrison's leg. The final item in the case was the small key. Harrison turned it over in his hand, wondering what it unlocked. His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. He froze, his heart pounding. No one ever came to the cabin, especially not in the middle of winter. He glanced at Scout, who was already on his feet, his body tense and his ears pricked forward. Harrison approached the door cautiously, gripping the key tightly. He opened it a crack, the cold air rushing in. A man stood on the porch, bundled in a heavy coat. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hood, but his voice was clear and authoritative. "Mr. Ford," the man said, "we need to talk about what you've found." Harrison's grip on the door tightened, his knuckles white. Scout growled low, standing between Harrison and the stranger as if sensing the tension. "Who are you?" Harrison asked, his voice steady despite the unease creeping into his chest. The man stepped forward, pulling back his hood to reveal a weathered face, lines etched deep from years of hard living. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Harrison's. "My name's Carter. I used to work with your father," he said, "and if you've opened that case, you're in over your head." The mention of his father's name hit Harrison like a punch to the gut. He hesitated for a moment before stepping back to let the man inside. Scout stayed close, his gaze never leaving Carter. "Talk," Harrison said, gesturing to the table where the case and its contents were spread out. "Start explaining." Carter walked to the table, his eyes scanning the documents and the small key. He let out a heavy sigh, rubbing a hand over his face. "I never thought I'd see this again," he muttered. Harrison crossed his arms. "You worked with my dad? On what? Operation Sentinel?" Carter nodded slowly. "Your father was the lead engineer on the project. We were tasked with developing a new energy source, something clean, efficient, and powerful enough to change the world. But things didn't go as planned." "What happened?" Harrison asked, his voice edged with frustration. "There was an accident," Carter said, his tone grim. "The energy source wasn't stable. We didn't know it at the time, but the tests we were running were causing anomalies, strange phenomena, equipment failing, people hearing things that weren't there." He paused, his gaze distant. "Your father tried to shut it down, but it was too late. The energy surged and the site had to be abandoned. They sealed it up and swore everyone to secrecy." "Why didn't he tell me any of this?" Harrison asked, anger rising in his chest. Carter met his eyes. "He was protecting you. He didn't want you to carry the weight of what happened." Harrison sat down heavily, running a hand through his hair. The pieces were starting to come together, but there were still so many questions. "What's with the key?" he asked, holding it up. Carter's expression darkened. "That key unlocks a chamber beneath the bunker. It's where we stored the core of the energy source. After the accident, we couldn't risk leaving it exposed, so we locked it away. But if you've disturbed that site, there's a chance the core is destabilizing again." Harrison's stomach sank. "You're saying it's still dangerous?" "More than you can imagine," Carter said. "That core holds enough energy to level everything within 100 miles if it goes critical." Scout let out a sharp bark, drawing their attention. The dog stood at the window, his ears alert. Outside, the snow-covered landscape was still, but Scout's unease was palpable. "We don't have much time," Carter said, grabbing his coat. "We need to go back to the bunker and secure the core before it's too late." The journey back to the bunker was harrowing. The snow had begun to fall again, the wind picking up as if the mountain itself were warning them away. Harrison led the way with Scout by his side, while Carter followed closely, carrying a heavy-duty tool bag. When they reached the bunker, the air felt heavier, charged with an unseen force. The metal door creaked as Harrison pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty halls. Inside, the atmosphere was even more oppressive than before. The faint hum of energy vibrated through the walls, and Scout whined softly, his tail tucked low. "Where's the chamber?" Harrison asked, his flashlight sweeping the corridor. "Follow me," Carter said, his voice tense. He led them to the back of the bunker, where a reinforced steel door stood. The same insignia was etched into the metal, along with the words, "Authorized personnel only." Harrison pulled out the key and slid it into the lock. It turned with a heavy click, and the door groaned open, revealing a staircase that descended into darkness. The chamber below was unlike anything Harrison had ever seen. The walls were lined with thick cables, and in the center of the room stood a containment unit glowing faintly blue. The hum of energy was louder here, almost deafening. Carter approached the unit cautiously, inspecting the readings on an old control panel. "It's worse than I thought," he said. "The core is destabilizing. If we don't shut it down manually, it's going to blow." "How do we stop it?" Harrison asked. "We need to vent the excess energy," Carter said, opening his tool bag. He pulled out a set of insulated gloves and a strange device that looked like a portable generator. "But it's not going to be easy. The system is decades old and the fail-safes are probably fried." As Carter worked, Harrison noticed Scout pacing near the entrance, his ears twitching. The dog stopped suddenly, staring down the corridor with a low growl. "What's wrong, boy?" Harrison asked, moving toward him. Before he could reach Scout, the lights in the chamber flickered, and the hum of energy grew louder. Carter cursed under his breath. "We've got to hurry." Harrison returned to Carter's side, helping him connect the generator to the containment unit. The machine sputtered to life, its lights blinking as it began to draw the excess energy. For a moment, it seemed like they were making progress. But then a warning alarm blared and the containment unit began to vibrate violently. "It's too unstable," Carter shouted. "We need to shut it down completely or we're done for." Harrison glanced at Scout, who was barking furiously now, as if trying to tell them something. "We'll figure it out," Harrison said, his voice firm. "We didn't come this far to fail." As the chamber shook around them, Harrison and Carter raced against time to stop the core from unleashing its devastating power. The chamber roared with energy, the vibrations rattling the walls and sending dust cascading from the ceiling. The blue glow of the containment unit pulsed erratically, each flash brighter than the last. Harrison could feel the tension in the air, like standing too close to a lightning strike. Carter shouted over the noise, his hands flying across the control panel. "The system's too old. The energy levels are spiking. If we don't shut it down in the next 5 minutes, this whole place is going up." Scout barked frantically, his sharp cries echoing through the bunker. He darted to the doorway, then back to Harrison as if urging him to move faster. "What do we do?" Harrison demanded, gripping the edge of the control panel. Carter pointed to a small access hatch on the side of the containment unit. "We have to manually release the core. If we can vent the energy into the mountainside, it might stabilize long enough for us to shut it down completely." "And if it doesn't?" Carter's face was grim. "Then we're not walking out of here." Harrison didn't hesitate. He pulled on the insulated gloves Carter had brought and crouched by the hatch. The metal was searing hot to the touch, even through the thick fabric, but he forced the latch open, revealing a cylindrical core glowing an almost blinding white. The hum of energy became a deafening roar, vibrating through Harrison's entire body. "Careful!" Carter yelled. "One wrong move and it'll detonate." Harrison gritted his teeth, his hands steady as he began to unscrew the bolts holding the core in place. The heat was overwhelming, beads of sweat streaming down his face despite the cold air of the bunker. Scout barked again, his tail low as he paced nervously. Harrison glanced at the dog and felt a strange surge of calm. "It's okay, boy," he said, his voice steady. "We've got this." As the final bolt came loose, the core began to hum louder, shaking violently in its housing. Harrison carefully lifted it out, its weight surprising him. Carter was beside him in an instant, attaching a device to the core that resembled a long cable with a series of clamps. "This will redirect the energy into the rock," Carter explained, his voice tight with focus. "It should buy us enough time to stabilize the system." "Should?" Harrison shot him a look but didn't argue. Together they maneuvered the core into a metal cylinder Carter had brought, securing it tightly. Carter worked quickly, connecting the cables to the containment unit and the walls of the chamber. "All right," Carter said, his fingers hovering over the controls. "Once I flip this switch, the energy will vent into the mountain. If we're lucky, it'll hold." "And if we're not?" Harrison asked. Carter didn't answer. The moment Carter hit the switch, the chamber was bathed in blinding blue light. The sound was deafening, a high-pitched whine that seemed to pierce through Harrison's skull. He grabbed Scout, pulling the dog close as the energy surged through the cables and into the mountainside. The ground shook violently, and for a terrifying moment, Harrison thought the entire bunker was going to collapse. But then, as quickly as it started, the light dimmed and the noise subsided. Carter slumped against the wall, breathing heavily. "It worked," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Harrison looked at the containment unit. The core was still glowing faintly, but the pulsing had slowed, the energy no longer threatening to explode. Scout licked Harrison's face, his tail wagging weakly. Harrison let out a shaky laugh, relief washing over him. "Good job, buddy," he said, scratching behind the dog's ears. As the three of them made their way out of the bunker, the early morning light was just beginning to break over the mountains. The storm had passed, leaving the landscape eerily quiet. Harrison turned to look back at the bunker, the insignia on the door glinting faintly in the dawn. "What happens now?" Harrison asked. Carter adjusted the straps on his bag. "I'll report this to the agency I used to work for. They'll want to secure the site, make sure nothing like this happens again. And the core? We stabilized it, but it's still dangerous. They'll probably move it to a safer location." Harrison nodded, his gaze distant. "My father, he tried to stop this, didn't he?" Carter placed a hand on Harrison's shoulder. "He did everything he could. He wasn't just trying to protect the world. He was trying to protect you." Back at the cabin, Harrison sat on the porch steps with Scout at his side. The dog rested his head on Harrison's knee, his eyes half closed as they watched the sun rise over the mountains. Harrison held the journal he'd found in the bunker, his fingers tracing the faded handwriting on the cover. He thought about his father, about the sacrifices he'd made and the secrets he'd carried. "You'd be proud of him," Harrison said quietly, his words meant for the wind. Scout let out a soft huff, as if agreeing. For the first time in years, Harrison felt a sense of peace. The mountain that had once been his place of solitude now felt like a bridge to something greater, a connection to his father, to Scout, and to the man he was becoming. As the sun climbed higher, casting golden light over the snow-covered peaks, Harrison stood, his hand resting on Scout's head. "Come on, boy," he said. "Let's see what's out there." Together, they walked down the path, leaving behind the cabin and the secrets it held, ready to face whatever came next.